The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our fourth and final installment of our four-part webinar series with FACS. Thanks for hopping on here as we head into the holiday season. My name is Patrick Bello. I'm a product manager for Bullard, and we're happy to partner and bring to you this webinar focusing on industrial environments. So Bullard and FACS, we both have the same organizational goal. We're both trying to protect and educate industrial workers. So at Bullard, we are a family-owned company based in Cynthiana, Kentucky, and we manufacture and engineer industrial respirators, supplied airline monitoring and filtration products, as well as head protection. We're the inventor of the hard hat. And one of our goals and missions is to increase the education and understanding of respiratory and industrial safety. So we're partnering with Certified Industrial Hygiene. FACS is a national industrial hygiene consulting group. And Michelle, specifically, she has more than 19 years of experience managing complex environmental health and industrial hygiene projects. She's a nationally recognized expert who has presented on technical topics at conferences and symposiums throughout the country. Michelle's also published several significant publications related to various industrial hygiene topics and concerns. And she's also an expert in wildfire smoke hazards. So we're very happy to have Michelle with us and looking forward to getting into the presentation. But first, just a couple housekeeping things. So as you have questions, please click on that icon and just go ahead and submit those. We'll answer those throughout and have some follow-up questions at the end of the session as well. Throughout the webinar, we'll have a series of polling questions. Feel free to engage in those. Just kind of helps us keep pace with the webinar and make sure everybody's engaged and interactive. So with that, if you need a webinar for today's, a certificate for today's webinar, send us a note and we will get you that certificate. But thanks everybody for your attendance today. We will follow up with a link back to the other webinars that we've conducted this year, and we're looking forward to bringing you 4 more webinars next year. So thanks again. Michelle?
Thank you, Patrick, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. As Patrick stated, this is the last of the 2024 educational webinars hosted by FACS and Bullard. For part 4 of the 4-part series, we'll be discussing respiratory regulation. So within that, we'll go over when are respirators required to be worn, as well as some of the specifics with regard to the respiratory protection program and the respiratory protection standard that outlines the requirements of the program, as well as fit testing. So in industrial hygiene, we always like to put out this slide. You'll probably see it in the majority of industrial hygiene presentations, and that's a hierarchy of controls. Yes, we're talking about respiratory protection. However, we know that tends to be the least effective methods in terms of controls, but something that's required when you can't do all of the other potential controls. Elimination obviously is the best. Substitution, we mostly use the engineering controls and administrative controls, but there are times when those won't be effective enough. You cannot control the hazards, and therefore you need to wear respiratory protection. And then I'll also go over, there are actual substance-specific standards that outline the use of respiratory protection, regardless of what controls you use in place and regardless of your actual exposure and data proving the exposure limits. So we'll go over that. It's very interesting and some of the newer standards that have gone out. So OSHA's respiratory protection standard, in a nutshell, says, in the control of occupational diseases caused by breathing contaminated air, the primary objective shall be to prevent atmospheric contamination. Makes sense, right? So how are we going to do this? Well, we want to use that hierarchy of controls that we discussed, the engineering controls, ventilation, substitution. However, when effective controls are not feasible or when instituted do not reduce low levels of exposures to below occupational exposure limits, appropriate respiratory protection shall be worn. So when is this? When is it going to be required? Well, you're going to have to wear a respirator, and it is required by the law to wear it if you are above occupational exposure limits. There's also, as I already stated, some substance-specific standards that will require respiratory use. Work activity-specific standards. Sometimes you might have in-house employer requirements where your employer maybe doesn't necessarily have exposure data, or there is no occupational exposure limits available, where they will require the use of a respirator. And then there's also confined space entry when you're dealing with oxygen deficient atmospheres or IDLH situations. This last bullet, we're really not going to talk about in this presentation. We're going to be more on the occupational exposure limits, substance specific standards, and work activities. So when I talk about occupational exposure limits, what does that mean? Well, we're talking about OSHA regulatory permissible exposure limits. So this is a table from the federal OSHA website that goes over the federal OSHA standards. Remember, there are state plans that may have different occupational exposure limits. So if you are a nationwide company or you're working in certain states, you don't always just rely on the federal OSHA standards. You need to make sure that it's your specific state or work in which location or state in which work is being performed, that there aren't specific standards associated with that state itself. So if you exceed any one of the permissible exposure limits, that can be the 8-hour time weighted average or the short-term exposure limit or the ceiling limits, you are required to wear respiratory protection because your current controls cannot reduce the exposures to below these levels. And therefore, you need this respirator as pretty much the last line of defense to control exposures to you. And here, there's also recommended exposure limits here on the federal OSHA website. And I just want to pinpoint that those, again, aren't regulatory. The NIOSH one, the ACGIH, they're not regulatory. So regulatory-wise, you're not required to wear the respirator, but your employer may require that to be as best practice because we know those are the newer, more health-based data, non-politics associated with it, in which they think is a healthier standard than the older OSHA standards. So substance-specific standards, there's actually quite a bit of them, and they are tending to be a little bit more robust now, and you're seeing increased ones. The one I want to pinpoint is probably the biggest one in the last 2 or 3 years would be the silica standard. So for when we're talking just about federal OSHA, the construction standard on silica does state when respiratory protection is required. There's 2 different ways you can go about it. You can do your traditional occupational exposure limits with the collection of data, etc. Or with the silica construction standard, you can use what they call Table 1 that outlines specific work tasks, where the work task will be performed, and then it puts the specific level of respiratory protection to be worn, and generally is talking about the N95 respirators. If you are using this Table 1 and following it, you are required to wear a respirator, and therefore you are required to follow and implement a respiratory protection program and having that in place. Most recently in California, we've had what's called an emergency temporary standard for silica in the general industry, where they are also requiring the use of respirators to be worn for what they call high trigger tasks, and that's the fabrication industry. That's its own separate presentation, but they do require when respiratory protection will be used, the level of respiratory protection, and that's regardless of what your exposure data may say. You may be below limits of detection, action levels, and permissible exposure limits, but the use of a respirator is required. And therefore, when it's required, the respiratory protection program, fit testing, medical surveillance, all that go with it is also required. So it's very important to, when you're looking at a specific contaminant, one, identifying, does it have a substance-specific standard? And within that, if it does, is respiratory protection required, or are you doing your traditional industrial hygiene exposure assessments and collecting data? And if you're doing that, then you're comparing that data to the permissible exposure limits from the prior slide. There are a few other ones as well as the silica one, that's the biggest hot topic, but lead, they have trigger tasks which note what specific respiratory protection needs to be required, asbestos as well, wildfire smoke. So California, Washington, and Oregon all have wildfire standards in place. And within those standards, they do talk about the use of respiratory protection. There is a voluntary use side, and then when you hit a certain level of smoke, and they use AQI as their means of evaluating exposures to wildfire smoke, then there is a requirement to wear that respiratory protection. And again, everything else follows along with that, the respiratory protection program, et cetera, et cetera. There's many more to look at. I'm not going to list them all right here, but again, the importance is if you're looking for a specific contaminant, you need to identify, is there a substance-specific standard within federal OSHA and then also your state, and then within that, looking into researching whether or not respiratory protection is required by the standard itself. There are also work activities that call out the use of respirators because of the nature of the work that's being performed. Abrasive blasting is one, because we know that would generate high levels of airborne dust to be emitted into the air. It talks about within the standard of abrasive blasting, the use of respirators in certain circumstances, welding as well, hazardous waste operation emergency responses when we're going into a location where we may not know what's happening, there's a spill, etc. The use of a respirator is called out within the standard, spray coating operations, and many more. So looking at not only the specific substance that you're working with, but what is actual work activity. And there may be specific requirements on the respirator use, as well as the type and level of respirators to be used. So when we're talking again about this respiratory protection standard, it also states that a respirator shall be provided to each employee when such equipment is necessary to protect the health of such employee. The employee shall provide the respirator which is applicable and is suitable for the purpose intended. If you were at the last series for the Bullard and Facts 2024 webinars, that's what was discussed. It was identifying what is the most suitable and applicable respirator for the intended use of the work being performed. And then within that, the employer shall be responsible for the establishment and maintenance of a respiratory protection program, and the program should cover each employee required by the section to use a respirator. And so we'll go into, in the next few slides, the respiratory protection program and all the specific requirements associated with it. So if it is determined that a respirator is required, the employer must develop and implement a comprehensive written respiratory protection program with required work site specific procedures and elements for required respirator use. The program must be administered by a suitably trained program administrator, in addition to having certain program elements for the standard itself, as well as when voluntary use of respirators may occur at the facility. So what are the key elements for an effective respiratory protection program? So you need to make sure that within the program you have the risk assessment. How did you determine that a respirator was going to be used? Is it because of the substance specific standards? Did you collect using additional, traditional industrial hygiene practices, collect air monitoring data, for instance, that showed you were above permissible exposure limits that is required? Do you have maybe not necessarily exposure data, but objective data from other studies that have been formed? And for instance, maybe there is no occupational exposure limits to compare your data to. So based on review of safety data sheets, et cetera, you've determined that a respirator is required for employees. at your facility. That needs to all be understood and inputted into your program. And again, it may be, if you're working in a large facility, you may have various sections based on the different types of work and different hazards that are associated with that. The program also needs to include the selection of respirators. What type of respirators are being worn, level, the cartridges, the filters, etc. What is being used for those said work tasks that are required to wear respirators for. Again, that was the last presentation where we went over a lot on the selection of respirators, because that you have to do due diligence and do a lot of research and understanding what is necessary to protect that employee. Not one size fits all type of situation. You need to make sure you have the correct level of protection, as well as the type of respiratory cartridges or the filters to remove that hazard before going into the breathing zone of the employee. You also need to have the medical evaluation, trainings, fit testing, maintenance program, and evaluated program. So I'm going to go a little bit more detail in each one of these. So again, the risk assessment is also known as a hazard evaluation. And we already talked about this, just a traditional exposure assessment, making sure that you are assessing the individual and all the separate work tasks and contaminants to ensure that you're protecting the worker and you have chosen the right selection of respirators. Employees who wear respirators and are required to wear respirators must go through a medical evaluation, because they need to make sure that they are physically and psychologically stress imposed by, employees who use respirators must be able to tolerate the physical and psychological stress imposed by respirators. So a medical evaluation must be performed before wearing these respirators to ensure that the employee has the ability to wear them. And this needs to be performed by a physician or other licensed healthcare professional. With that, they usually have a questionnaire associated with that. I'll show you that on the next slide, where before you go in to see your medical professional, you need to let them know what type of respirator you're using. What is some of your work experience? What have you done in the past in terms of potential exposures and respiratory use? And then there's other generalized health-based questions. These all need to be completed, submitted to your healthcare professional along with a medical exam. And then they will determine whether or not you're fit to wear a respirator. And again, the typing use is very important because of the physical and psychological stress imposed by respirators. So a small N95 dust mask is less stress than putting a full face respirator on your face, where it's a tight fitted respirator and it's a little bit harder to breathe, a little bit more work on your lungs. So that needs to be input in the questionnaire so that your healthcare professional has the information to determine whether or not you're fit to wear that. And it's also important to know, because of those substance specific standards, that there may be additional requirements within the medical evaluation. I know, for instance, asbestos requires chest x-rays to be performed. Silica also now requires chest x-rays to be performed. If you're wearing a respirator and going through a medical evaluation for another contaminant, you may not necessarily need chest x-rays. That's not one of the requirements. But when you look at the substance specific ones, they may have additional requests that need to be performed and evaluations that need to be performed. Again, silica has a TB test that needs to be performed within the chest x-ray. And they may have different requirements on the frequency. Is this something that's done annually or maybe every 3 years? So you need to make sure that you're evaluating that before sending in your employees. And here is an example of a common regulatory and medical surveillance questionnaire examination. So it just kind of goes over what is your potential exposures that you might be exposed to in your general work practices, as well as some of the health-based questions. If you have a respiratory protection program, one of the most important things is training the employee. No one wants to just give someone a respirator and say, here, you're going to protect yourself and reduce exposures, because now you're relying on the employee to protect themselves alone. You need to make sure that you have a training program and it's outlined specifically what's going to be discussed in that training program within your respiratory protection program. That training must be effective, comprehensive, and understandable. At times you may be doing that in different languages so that you are ensuring that the employee understands the use of the respirator. This training needs to be performed prior to use of wearing this respirator. So a lot of times people may start a new job and it will take a while for you to begin the work with respirators because you have to go through the trainings, the medical evaluations, and the fit testing, which we'll go over a little bit later. This training needs to be performed at least annually at a minimum, or more often as necessary. So there may be times where someone doesn't appear to be understanding the use of how to wear the respirator appropriately, or there's potential exposure. So you may want to do the training more often for those employees. But at a minimum, per the regulations, it needs to be annually performed. Some of the key elements of a adequate or comprehensive training program is outlining why you need to use that respirator, giving the employee an understanding of there's exposure data, or we've used these type of controls and we can't reduce exposures to extent, so now you're wearing the respirators. It's also important to outline what the respirator can and cannot do to protect them. So for instance, when we're dealing with respirators, that's obviously an inhalation issue. But if there's potentially dermal issues, ingestion issues with the contaminant you're trying to control, we need to know that that respirator cannot protect you from everything. It's got its one job to do, and that's it. Other than that, it can't protect you from all potential exposures to the specific contaminant. The training program also needs to include how to properly inspect the respirator, how to put it on and take it off appropriately, and how to use it. There's specific requirements on looking at it. Is it working well? Is there any issues with it? The maintenance of it? Is there potentially a broken piece that needs to be fixed? Because obviously if your respirator is not intact to the full extent it's supposed to be, it's not going to protect you in the way it's supposed to be. You also need to include how to check the seal of your respirator, also known as a user seal check. Unlike other equipment we may use in industrial hygiene, you don't have the ability to calibrate it to ensure it's working appropriately. So we have what we call the user seal check. So every time you put on a respirator, you need to make sure that you put it on and it's sealed properly. And in my next slide, I'll go over some of the specific steps on doing the user seal check. But that's used to just determine that you're wearing it appropriately, it's fitted well, and that it's going to protect you before you do that job. And that needs to be done every time before you are exposed to any potential contaminants. The training also needs to go over how to use a respirator effectively in emergency situations, including situations in which the respirator doesn't work properly, what needs to be done in situations of that. Also, how to recognize medical signs and symptoms that may limit or prevent you from using a respirator. For instance, if there's a change in your health, that could be just medical issue, maybe an increase in weight, etc. Recognizing medical symptoms, maybe you feel ill that day, understanding that when you have these issues that they may limit or prevent you from using a respirator because it might be too much stress on the body, or it may be causing the other potential issues. So that needs to be discussed within your training program so people can recognize when and when not to use that respirator. Also, how improper fit, usage, or maintenance can reduce the respirator's ability to protect you. Again, if you're not wearing it properly, if it's not sealed on your face properly, then you have the potential for the contaminants to get into the respirator. And if it's not maintained properly, as any other piece of equipment, it may not protect you to the extent it's supposed to be. And it's very important that that's performed because you are using that as the last line of defense in terms of exposures. We've already tried to do all the other hierarchy controls. Now we have the last line of defense, and you need to make sure that it's properly maintained and used. Also, the procedures for the maintenance and storage of the respirators, and there's a lot of requirements for that, and I'll go over that. And then the requirements of the OSHA respiratory protection standards, which we're going over right now. So here's the user seal check. We do the positive pressure and negative pressure fit check. So one way is you put, you'll do the positive pressure to make sure when you blow out that it's still sealed to your face and doesn't pop open. So you will put your hand over the exhalation valve and gently blow out for about 10 seconds to make sure that it doesn't come off your face. You'll feel a slight pressure, and the respirator usually will bulge out just a little bit because it's now under positive pressure, but you shouldn't get any leaks or air going out. Similarly, we have the negative pressure fit check, where you will block the cartridges with the palms of your hand, and you will gently inhale. So you're putting the area here under a negative pressure, and you'll feel it slightly collapse, but you shouldn't get, again, it closing and that you feel leaks of air coming out of the respirator itself. So this is something that must be done whenever putting on respirators to make sure that it's sealed properly. And if it doesn't, then you need to start making adjustments to the straps to ensure that does. And then sometimes you might be doing this positive, negative pressure fit check 3 or 4 times and manipulating the respirator and the seal around your face. So I've been talking for a while, but we're going to do a quick knowledge check to just make sure everyone's still listening to me. So first questions is, you need to have training in respirator use. Is that A, at least annually? B, if changes in operations require a different type of respirator? C, if you are not using the respirator correctly? Or D, all of the above? And I'm not seeing the results.
Sorry about that, Michelle. It looks like most people thought it was D, all of the above, about 87%.
Okay, well, that is fantastic. That means everybody got it right and they are listening, so I do appreciate that. So yes, as we already said, minimum is annually, but if there are any changes to operations or the type of respirator, or if it's just not fitting correctly, they're going to do it sooner than that. Okay, fit testing. So if you are required to wear a respirator and it is a tight fitted respirator, you're required to have fit testing performed. And so similar to that positive negative pressure test, fit testing is done to ensure that the type of respirator that you are wearing can be properly fitted on your face. There are lots of different types of respirator. Bullard has lots of different type of respirators, and they may not always fit that individual's face the way it's supposed to fit because we have different, facial structures. So fit testing is required prior to the initial use of a respirator being worn. It's also required after employee has completed their medical evaluation and prior to being allowed to wear a respirator with a tight-fitting face piece in the work environment. I'll just like to back up a little bit. Respirators with loose-fitting face pieces, like if they're wearing the hoods or helmet for the PAPRs, which are the powered air purifying respirators, don't always require fit testing to be performed. This is usually the tight-fitting ones to make sure they are fitting your face properly. Fit testing is also required if you're going to wear a different face piece. So just because you have the medium size one on your face, the full face one, if you switch to a new respirator, now you need to do additional fit testing for that specific respirator. Fit testing needs to be done annually as well. And it's also done sooner if there's any changes in the employee's condition, physical conditions that may affect respiratory fit. So if there's obvious changes in weight gain or weight loss that may change the structure of the face, any facial scarring, etc., you should go back and do fit testing again to make sure that that respirator is fitting your face properly and sealed the way it needs to be in order to protect you from the specific contaminant. There are 2 accepted fit testing protocols. that OSHA outlines in Appendix A. There is what's called QLFT, that's the qualitative fit testing. And then there's also the quantitative fit testing. And so what those are qualitative, and I'll go into detail a little bit on in some future slides, but that kind of goes over where you're using the smoke tube or the Bittrex, and you're relying on the individual to let you know if they smell it or if they taste it, etc. The qualitative actually uses data to determine the effectiveness of that respirator, but we'll do a little bit more on that in some future slides. So within the fit testing, there's specific procedures that need to be formed. One, you need to make sure that the respirator that you plan on using is the one that you are being fit tested for. So sometimes there'll be 2 different brands or 2 different types of respirators available so that the individual can make sure the one they're wearing protects them best. You need to show within the fit testing procedures how to put on a respirator, show the individual the proper way of putting it on. There's a nice little system on how that's supposed to be performed. You need to make sure to assess the comfort of it. If it feels uncomfortable, if it's smashing the bridge of your nose, that's not going to be effective. That's not going to be comfortable, and no one's going to want to wear that respirator. So you want to make sure that it's properly placed and as comfortable as possible on their face, and that you go over the user seal check for the individuals within the fit testing procedures, because fit testing is a similar approach, but you can't do that every single time you're wearing the respirator. So you're going to have to rely on that user sealer check. And within the fit testing, you do a series of test exercise, whether it's qualitative or quantitative. You're going to make sure that the individual will follow all of these different exercises, and you'll go over it with them. Each one's about 1 minute long. You will do normal breathing to check the effectiveness. Then you will practice deep breathing for a minute. And again, this is all to simulate potential work practices that are being performed. If it's strenuous, you need breathe a little bit deeper to catch your breath. Turning your head from side to side, just normal operations, up and down. Talking. If anybody's been fit tested before, they know the rainbow passage, right? When sunlight strikes raindrops in the air, they act like a prism and form a rainbow. This is a passage. It's a lot longer, but it uses the mouth in a manner that kind of accentuates a lot of different words. You're going to be talking to when you're wearing a respirator. We want to make sure when you're talking, it doesn't adjust the seal when you're wearing it. Grimace, that's only for quantitative fit testing. That's one of the requirements. Bending over, jogging in place, and then going back to normal breathing. So you're doing all these series of exercises while doing your fit testing. And there are modified fit testing protocols available in Appendix A and the Appendix B1 within the Respiratory Protection Program standard. We'll talk about the user seal checks. So as I say, there's 2 different methods you can use. You could do the qualitative or you can do the quantitative fit testing. They both have their pros and their cons. Qualitative, it's cost effective. It's cheaper. You can do multiple people in a faster amount of time. It's really easy. All you need is a hood to go over with a hole where you could put in either the smoke or the Bittrex or the saccharinol, whatever material you choose to use. However, the con is that you rely on the subject to let you know if they smell it. So there is a potential that someone may want to do a job and so they're just going to say that the respirator they're using is appropriate because they want to move forward. They're not giving you the true accurate statement that yes, they smell it. So that's one of the big negatives. And it may only be used for negative pressure air purifying respirators that must achieve a fit factor of 100 or less. So they're great to use for lower scale, maybe respiratory use. But yeah, a lot of people use a qualitative method just because of the cost effectiveness. However, again, it doesn't give you as much accuracy and reliability as a quantitative because you're being more objective rather than subjective. So here's 2 photos or examples. So the one on the left is qualitative. So you see it's just an individual within a hood in your spraying material into that hood, and then the individual will follow those series of exercises and will let you know whether or not they can experience that contaminant that's been implemented into there. The photo on the right is a qualitative. So you're creating maybe, in the past I've created a particulate, you use salt water, create a particulate, and you're measuring the contaminant outside, and then you're measuring it within the respiratory protection that you're using, or the respirator, and then calculating the difference between the two. And there's a certain factor that the respirator is supposed to protect you from. So you're verifying that that is what it is doing and that the seal is proper. So you're not relying on an individual at all. You're relying on actual data points to tell you whether or not it is protecting the worker to the extent it's supposed to be. So I have another question here for you. Facial hair has no effect on a respirator seal. We did not go over this, but I want to know beforehand. Does facial hair have an effect on respirator seals? True or false? And Taylor, just let me know when you've got a majority.
All right, it looks like about 90% of people have said false.
Okay, yes, facial hair does have an effect on the seal. And I found this slide and I think it's amazing. Usually you just hear the term facial hair, right? But like, what does that mean? There's so many types. You know, you go out to any brewery these days, someone's got a different type of facial hair. So it kind of goes over right here from, it's a document created by CDC NIOSH that tells you what is acceptable facial hair and what's not. So the soul patch, it's right here, right? So that you can have that because it's not going to affect the seal on your face because it's going around that. However, a beard, obviously you have facial hair that's going along here, that's going to disturb the seal itself. The handlebars should be fine, right? So when a lot of people get upset when we're talking about respiratory protection and you talk about they need to be clean shaven. And yes, they do need to be clean shaven to an extent, but it's nice to have this document out here that you can have some facial hair in certain locations, but you need to make sure, again, that it's not disturbing the seal in which it's worn. Yes, so nice representation that should probably be in a lot of different facilities because people are very particular about their facial hair. So within your, again, we're back still talking about the respiratory protection program and all the key elements that need to be added and implemented within the program. And that's one of the important ones is the maintenance of it. So if you're not properly maintaining your respirator, you can no longer confirm its effectiveness in protecting your workers. So within the maintenance program, there is a specifics on cleaning and disinfection. Appendix B goes over that specifically on the storage of the respirators and inspection of the respirators. So the employers shall ensure that respirators are cleaned and disinfected using procedures in Appendix B2 of the section, as well as looking at the manufacturers. Because just think about it, you're wearing this respirator on your face. If anyone's worn one before, especially in hot environments, you're sweating in them. So your sweat is dripping. I've had it where it's dripping. You move over, the sweat's all over your face. They can get really dirty and really nasty. And you really need to make sure that you're properly cleaning and disinfecting them. And then using products that are appropriate for that respirator. We don't want to degrade any of the material within the respirator so that it causes it to be ineffective. Storage is also important. I've seen people just, throw them in the trunk of their car or just hang them in locations, just outside of their work area. And that's not appropriate. We want to make sure we're storing them to protect them from damage, from contamination, from different workspaces, dust, sunlight, extreme temperatures, or other potential chemical exposures. We don't want to degrade the use of that respirator. So they need to be properly stored. Also, within the maintenance program, we need to talk about the inspection because each time you put it on, you need to inspect it. before it's used and after it's used, just to make sure that it is, there are no issues with it, nothing's missing from it, all the pieces are in place. And then repair. You don't require your employees to repair them. You need to note in your program that someone appropriately trained will be doing the repair. And that might be going back to manufacturers, or maybe there's someone at your facility who's trained, properly trained on how to repair respirators. So inspecting the respirator, again, this needs to be done before and after its use. You need to make sure to train employees on how to maintain the respirators, changing things such as the straps, making sure that those are not breaking or can potentially break off during the work being performed. So you need to be able to inspect that, train them on how to clean within it, taking out the pieces, because you will have to remove pieces. Sometimes you'll remove the exhalation valve to get in there to do the cleaning. So you need to be able to open it properly, inspect it, and know how to put it back on. So there's a lot of different pieces associated with a respirator. So individuals need to be trained on all the different pieces, how to remove them properly, how to clean them, and then how to put them back on. So let's do another knowledge check. When should a respirator be inspected? Only after use in an immediately dangerous to life or health environment? Should they be inspected annually? C, before and after each use? Or D, as determined by the respirator wearer? So everyone should get this one correct at this point.
Looking good so far. It looks like 100% of people have said C, before and after each use.
Perfect. Yes. Just went over that slide, before and after each use. Before you put it on, you want to make sure it's appropriate, everything is good, and then after, to make sure there wasn't any issues while you were wearing the respirator. So in addition to all of the other elements we talked about, you need to also evaluate the program. That needs to be done just to make sure that everything you've been doing, let's say, for the year is still the same thing that's occurring. Did you add a new contaminant? Did you add a new work activity? So you need to evaluate your program to make sure that it is still appropriate for the work in which it's been performed. So the program must be evaluated periodically or as necessary. So you need to pick a frequency. I would say a minimum annually. Just looking over it, making sure everything is still applicable. But you may determine that things are changing so much at your facility, new people in, new people out, that you may want to do it on a higher frequency. Or maybe it's just nothing ever changes. Maybe you're doing it every so often, but you do need to note how often you're going to be auditing the program to ensure its elements are being complied with. And with that, not just having one individual, the program administrator, do it, but you need to talk with employees. Do they feel that this respirator that they're wearing is appropriate? There may be a circumstance where they say, it's really hard for us to get the work done with this specific type of respirator. Is there anything else we could potentially be doing to change respirators by maybe adding new additional controls? All this needs to be taken into account when evaluating your program. And in addition to, again, is the fit still appropriate? Is the selection still appropriate? There wasn't new chemicals added, used in maintenance. Is the maintenance, are you using the same chemicals for the cleaning and disinfection, etc.? Always something that needs to be thought of. In the next few slides, I'm going to go over voluntary use of respirators, because there always seems to be a confusion on that. And I get it, because somebody wants to wear a respirator at work. What do we need to do to be in compliance with standards and regulations, right? So what is voluntary use? It's when a respirator is not required by an employer, when someone is below occupational exposure limits, and there is no substance specific standard that says it needs to be worn, but the employee wants to wear it, for instance. So they can do it as long as it is not a health hazard to the individual wearing it. So someone could wear a respirator as long as it doesn't create a new hazard because they're wearing it. When someone wants to voluntarily use a respirator, certain elements of a respiratory protection program need to be implemented, with the exception of when you're wearing just the N95 dust mask. So if you have determined as a company that no respiratory protection is required based on all of the elements I say in bullet number 1 there, but someone says, I do want to wear a half face respirator just because I don't feel like I'm being protected, or maybe I have a sensitivity, or, for any reason they want to wear it. You have to develop a written respiratory protection program that includes certain sections. And what that is, the proper cleaning, storage, and maintenance of that respirator, so they know how to properly store it, clean it, and maintain it, and the medical evaluation, because again, because you're putting so much stress on the body when wearing respirators, we want to make sure that the person is medically evaluated so that they can wear it. And you also have to provide them a copy of Appendix D, which is in the respiratory protection program, that talks about the voluntary use of respirators. So here's a series of questions. So if an employee pays for and allows respirators to be worn on a voluntary basis when respirator protection is not required to meet an OSHA standard, is it then regarded as though the employer is mandating the use of respirators? And we're not going to go over, we're not going to do the knowledge check where you guys have to answer this. I'm just going to give you the answers. We'll give them to you easily and free, right? So no, the use of respirator is not regarded as mandatory unless required under the standard, or the employee requires that employee to wear the respirator, regardless of exposure assessment results. It's just as I stated in the slide beforehand. If you're allowed to wear it on voluntary basis to meet the standard. So you're allowing them to wear it. It's not mandated. Question 2, is the employee required to pay for respirators if considered voluntary use? This is a big one, right? You are saying as a company, you don't have to wear them. It's not required. Are you then required to pay for that respirator for the individual? And the response, this is all from the OSHA website, the employer is not required to pay for filtering face piece respirators used voluntarily by employees. If you permit the use of respirators other than filtering face pieces, you must pay for required medical evaluations for voluntary users and provide voluntary users with appropriate facilities and time to clean, disinfect, maintain, and store the respirators. So if you're using just the filtering face piece respirators, you're not required to pay for them. But if you're using something other than that, you must pay for those medical evaluations to make sure that their body can withstand the use of it, as well as provide appropriate facilities for the cleaning and maintaining of those ones. So that would be maybe the half face respirators, full face respirators, etc. Question 3, if the employer allows voluntary use of respirator, is the employer required to fit test the employees? Answer, no. The voluntary use of respirators in work atmospheres which are not hazardous does not require the respirator wearer to be fit tested. However, if employees allow the voluntary use of elastomeric face piece and powered air purified respirators, the employer must implement the elements of a written respiratory protection program necessary to ensure that employees voluntarily using such respirators are medically fit to do so, and that the respirator is clean, stored, and maintained so that its use does not present a hazard to the user. So pretty much similar to some of the other questions. Question 4, we already did this, right? Is facial hair allowed with voluntary use respirators? It's not prohibited. It's discouraged because, again, you want to educate them and let them know that you have a potential ineffectiveness of the seal of the respirator because of the facial hair. But because it was never required, they're not prohibited to do so. And so one more knowledge check. According to OSHA's respiratory protection requirement, employees who use respirators should be properly trained on their use. Which one is not part of the information that an employee needs to know? A, how to maintain the upkeep of the respirator. B, how to use the respirator. C, how to select the right respirator, or D, how to develop a respiratory protection program, which is one is not part of the information needed.
We still got a few responses coming in. All right, it looks like 83% of people went with D, how to develop a respiratory protection program.
Amazing. Yep. They're not required to know how to develop a respiratory protection program. The employee needs to know how to maintain one, how to select the right respirator to be used, and how to use a respirator, but they do not need to know how to develop a respiratory protection program. So that is it. That is the regulatory standards associated with respiratory protection use. Again, we went over when is it required, the respiratory protection program itself, and then fit testing. Any questions do we have, Taylor?
Yes, we had a few come in. We'll start with, can fit testing be performed by the employer with the correct training and equipment?
Yes.
Perfect.
Yes, they can. So I would recommend going through the standard to go over the specific. I just went fairly quickly on one slide, but it will tell you how to perform fit testing.
Wonderful. Next question that came in, do N95s require fit testing?
Yes, when they're used to control a hazard, yes. So if you're above, so again, a lot of times the N95s are the ones that are on the voluntary use basis. People are wearing them, but that is a form of respiratory protection with a specific assigned protection factor. So if you are wearing that respirator to protect you from overexposures because of the substance specific standards or because you're above permissible exposure limits, you need to be fit tested for that N95. Because there are various different models available out there. So you want to make sure the one you're wearing is appropriate for maybe your facial structure or the working form.
All right, next question. Can you please provide a little more information on the respiratory requirements for the wildfire smoke standards in California, Oregon, and Washington?
Yes, good question. So that's actually a great question for the one that just happened too, because for California, Oregon, and Washington, all three have wildfire standards. And the respirator they talk about is the N95. So within each one of those standards, they talk about recommended use of respirators. And then when you hit a certain AQI value with regard to PM 2.5, there is a requirement to wear that respirator. And once you are required to wear that respirator, then you have to follow respiratory protection program. Within each one of those different state regulations, I think it's Washington, they have a revised version of the respiratory protection standard when you hit a certain AQI value before you're getting to that, what they call their regulatory exposure limit of it. But we have actually at FACS, we did a webinar that I believe that outlined all the different 3 state wildfire standards and kind of goes over the evolution of the wildfire standard and the differences between the 3 different states and when respiratory protection is provided. So I believe we could probably provide that information to individuals if they're interested in finding more about that.
Yes, absolutely. If anybody is interested in learning more about that, shoot us a note via chat or through email. But that is all the questions we've had come in for the day. If you guys have any outstanding questions that come up after this, please feel free to reach out to us. We'll send a copy of this recording to you, to everybody who attended and registered, so you can revisit it along with Michelle's contact information should you have anything come up. And as Michelle and Patrick mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, this is the last of the 4-part series for 2024, but we will be doing another 4-part series, FACS and Bullard will, this next year. So we will send out those topics that we're just finalizing right now to everybody who's attended any of our webinars this year. So keep your eye out for those, and we look forward to seeing you in the new year. And thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Patrick. Have a lovely rest of your day, and we'll see you next year. Thanks all.
Thank you.